Not war, not natural disasters, not a trumpet blasting across the sky. The collapse of the world does not start with what terrifies people. It starts with what makes them feel safe. There was a long stretch of time when humanity believed it had finally stepped out of history's shadow. Cities stayed lit all night. Highways never slept. Growth charts climbed so steadily that people started to believe tomorrow was guaranteed. Every morning people woke up, went to work, built, traded, fell in love, had children, and made plans for years that had not even arrived yet, with a quiet, absolute confidence that the world was still sitting neatly in human hands. Ancient warnings about the last day, about judgment, about the reversal of order slowly became a distant echo. They were filed away with symbolic stories, myths from an era that did not know any better, beliefs for generations that were not advanced enough. In the age of science, technology, and artificial intelligence, people were convinced they did not need to listen to whispers from the past anymore. The world looked solid, systems ran with precision, seasons arrived on schedule. The sun rose and set so reliably that people forgot it had never belonged to them. And out of that long stability, a dangerous conclusion formed in the collective mind. If everything still worked, maybe nothing was really wrong. If society was still standing, maybe morality was just a side issue. If the world had not collapsed, maybe humanity was on the right path. That is where the biggest illusion was born. The illusion that humans do not just live in this world, but control it. That they do not just adapt to history, but rewrite history to fit their will. Control the economy, control nature, control life itself. And finally, believe they can control the future. But history has never ended with human confidence. It always ends with the moment people realize they have lost something essential, even while everything still looks intact on the outside. There are times when the real danger is not chaos, but prolonged calm. When people stop asking questions, when they no longer feel the need to watch themselves. When morality is reduced to personal preference and truth is treated as relative opinion. The world does not need to shake to begin collapsing. It only needs people to stop staying awake inside, and that is exactly where this story begins. Welcome to Prophetic History Explained, where we do not just retell history. We peel back the warnings that were ignored so we can understand why humanity keeps making the same mistake right before everything changes forever. Because the scariest thing is not the day the world ends. The scariest thing is when people are sure that day will never come. Real collapse does not arrive with screams. It arrives in the silence of a world that is too busy to listen. It comes when people stop waiting, stop preparing, stop examining themselves. When every gaze is fixed forward but nobody looks up anymore. And if you think a stable, civilized, advanced world cannot collapse from the inside, then you are standing exactly where every civilization before you once stood right before it disappeared. If you want to understand why collapse does not begin with war, why whispers are more dangerous than bombs, and why history always turns when people believe they are safe, stay with us to the end of this video, where the full picture will slowly come into focus. And if you feel that content like this gives you a deeper, sharper, more awake perspective, subscribe to Prophetic History Explained and support us. Your support is what fuels us to keep making the next videos, digging deeper into warnings, historical cycles, and the moments humanity usually recognizes only when it is already too late. No one can point to the exact moment when everything started drifting off course. There was no date circled on a calendar, no single event big enough for history to officially record. The world kept running. The clock kept moving. But somewhere deep underneath, a quiet shift had taken place. At first, it was just a feeling, a vague, hard-to-name sensation, like the air had grown a little heavier, like familiar things no longer brought the same comfort as before. People started feeling uneasy without any clear reason. Not because they lacked anything, but because of a strange instinct that something was changing, even if the surface of the world still looked intact. Conversations began to change. People did not talk as freely as they used to. Harmless topics suddenly felt sensitive. Words were chosen more carefully. Eyes lingered a little longer. No one said it out loud, but everyone sensed it. Trust, the thing that used to connect people naturally, was starting to withdraw. On screens, the news came faster and thicker, but it did not bring clarity. It brought noise. Real information, false information, rumors, guesses, all blended together into a constant atmosphere of tension. People stopped knowing what to believe, and in that fog they started doubting each other more than they doubted the sources. At a deeper level, the cracks spread into relationships that once felt unbreakable. Longtime friends became guarded. Neighbors stopped feeling safe around each other. Communities once held together by familiarity and shared history began building invisible walls. Not with weapons, but with silence and distance. In the corridors of power, the shift was quiet but obvious. Agreements that were once signed in good faith were now reread through suspicion. Nations stopped talking about a shared future and focused on protecting their own interests. The language of cooperation gave way to the language of caution. Long-term plans were replaced by short-term strategies built around one question. If something terrible happens, who survives? What is striking is that all of this was happening while the world had not actually collapsed yet. No global war, no catastrophe large enough to justify the fear. But the fear was still there, spreading, rooting itself deep in people's minds. It did not need a clear reason because it was being fed by a loss of control, the sense that what used to feel certain could no longer be trusted. People began to look at the world as a place full of hidden danger instead of a shared space to live together. Every action, every decision, every relationship was filtered through defense. People prepared for something bad even though they could not name what that bad thing was. And in that preparation, social connection was slowly worn down, piece by piece. This fracture is dangerous not because it is loud, but because it normalizes unease. People get used to living on edge. They accept suspicion as a normal feature of modern life. They start calling the loss of trust reasonable, even smart. And when losing trust becomes the standard, society has crossed a very important line. Because a world can survive material crises, but a world that no longer trusts itself cannot stand for long. The real shift is not happening on the ground. It is happening inside people. When people start believing every relationship can betray them, every alliance can collapse, every promise can be meaningless, they stop living in the present. They live in prediction, in anxiety, in constant preparation for the worst-case scenario. And in that moment, the world has entered a new phase, even if nobody has named it yet. A phase where society is no longer built on trust and shared responsibility, but on caution and quiet selfishness. There is no explosion to announce it, no obvious warning sign to stop and turn around, only a slow slide, steady and almost impossible to reverse. The collapse has not arrived yet, but what makes collapse unavoidable has already begun. Then there comes a point when what was once only anxiety in the mind steps out of the shadows and into real life. It is no longer a feeling, no longer a prediction. The breakdown now has a shape, a sound. Consequences so clear no one can deny them. Conflicts that had been contained for years begin flaring up almost all at once. Not all of them start as full-scale wars, but as smaller clashes, flashpoints that once seemed manageable. But the world no longer has the patience to cool them down. Every tension gets amplified faster than people can put it out. Borders harden. The roads that once connected nations become lines of confrontation. At the same time, the systems that were once considered society's backbone begin snapping. Supply chains break, energy becomes unstable, food stops arriving at the right time, in the right places. Cities that relied on perfect circulation of goods begin tasting shortage, not because the world has run out, but because the order that once distributed abundance no longer runs the way it used to. When basic needs are threatened, people learn a brutal truth. Modern civilization is far more fragile than they ever thought. Break a few links and the whole system can slide toward chaos. Things once guaranteed by contracts, laws, and international agreements become meaningless in the face of spreading fear. And then, while society is still struggling with what humans have done to themselves, nature stops acting neutral. The ground starts shaking in places that never used to shake. Earthquakes no longer stay within the familiar zones. They hit without warning, breaking the last comfort people had left. The belief that at least the planet still follows rules. We understand. The sea is no longer calm. Waves push past what was once considered safe, swallowing coastlines and erasing cities built over generations. The sky carries strange signs that make people look up, not with familiarity but with growing unease. What used to feel stable becomes unpredictable, as if the natural order itself is reacting to something deeper. But in the middle of all those visible losses, the most terrifying collapse does not happen in the ruins of buildings or the devastation of land. It happens inside people. When survival becomes the highest priority, values that once felt foundational begin to wobble. Compassion does not vanish overnight, but it gets pushed behind self-protection. Kindness becomes conditional. Justice gets postponed, then sacrificed completely when hunger, thirst, and fear close in. People start justifying actions they once condemned. What used to be called wrong is now called necessary. Self-interest overwhelms shared responsibility. The stronger take more and call it survival instinct. The weaker are left behind, and the abandonment gets explained away with reasons that sound practical. The law still exists, but it is not respected the way it used to be. It is applied selectively, bent to fit circumstances, and sometimes ignored altogether. Morality stops being a shared compass and becomes a personal choice. Everyone draws their own line, and when there is no common line left, society starts sliding into lawlessness, not because there are no rules, but because there is no agreement on what is right. The saddest part is that many people do not realize they are losing the very thing that makes them human. They tell themselves they are just adapting, that this is the rational response to a harsh world. But in that adaptation, conscience gets worn down, empathy goes dull, and the sense of shared duty slowly disappears. Disasters can be repaired, cities can be rebuilt, crops can be replanted, but when morality collapses, no machine and no technology can recreate it quickly. And when a society loses its moral foundation, every attempt to rebuild the physical world is just patchwork on a structure rotting from the inside. At that point, the world is not just wounded, it is disoriented. There is no real shelter left, not only because land and sea have become dangerous, but because people no longer find safety even inside their own communities. Collapse has reached every layer of existence, and when nothing stands firm anymore, humanity is forced to face the question it avoided for far too long. If everything can collapse, then what or who can actually hold this world together? When the world is exhausted by chaos, when people do not have the strength to absorb one more shock, the deepest need is no longer truth. It is relief. People stop asking what is right or wrong. They ask what helps them survive one more day, sleep through one more night, feel less pain in the present. And inside that empty space, a familiar shape from history shows up again. A promise of salvation. At first, it is not a single person, but scattered voices, people who claim they understand what is happening. Messages that feel comforting, saying suffering is not the consequence of moral failure, but an inevitable stage of progress. They say there is no need to repent, no need to change inside, only a need to change your perspective. Those words spread fast because they demand no sacrifice. They do not force anyone to face moral responsibility. Then out of that crowd of voices, one figure starts to stand out, not through intimidation, but through magnetism. He shows up at exactly the right moment with a calm voice, smooth language, and the confidence of someone who seems to hold the answer the world has been desperate for. No condemnation, no warnings, no talk of sin, just solutions, order, a new path out of chaos. He promises stability, and for a while that promise seems real. Systems restart, food gets distributed, security tightens, streets get quieter. People exhale and believe the world has finally found its guide. Not because he is right, but because he is effective. But the price of that order is not paid in material goods. It is paid in loyalty. Not loyalty to law, but loyalty to him. Not obedience to principles, but submission. People who ask questions are labeled obstacles. People who hesitate are labeled threats. And very quickly, the new order demands more than silence. It demands worship. What makes this deception so dangerous is not cruelty from the start, but how reasonable it feels. In a world that is exhausted, trading inner freedom for outer safety sounds acceptable. People convince themselves it is only temporary, that sacrificing a little conscience is necessary to keep society from collapsing completely. At the same time, under the spotlight and the bold declarations, another current still exists, quiet and fragile. No power, no platforms, no protection. Just people who refuse to call lies truth, who refuse to bow to human power even when it costs them everything. They do not gather in large numbers. They do not dominate public space. They exist in private meetings, in whispered conversations, in small, steady acts of faithfulness. Their message is not easy to hear. It does not promise instant relief. It does not offer quick fixes. It calls for repentance, humility, and loyalty in a world that worships ego and power. That is why it is dismissed as outdated, negative, even dangerous. The people who hold it are branded rigid, disruptive, threats to the fragile stability society has just regained. The contrast becomes obvious. On one side is a comfortable promise protected by power and profit. On the other side is a difficult truth protected only by sacrifice. One side spreads fast, takes the stage, shapes public opinion. The other spreads slowly, one person at a time, with no guarantee of safety, no guarantee of success, but impossible to buy. As the new power tightens its grip, tolerance fades. Those who do not submit are pushed out of the system. They cannot buy or sell. They cannot be protected. They are no longer treated as part of society. Pressure comes not only from the authorities, but from communities that have grown addicted to stability and terrified of losing it. Families turn on each other. Friends drift away. Loyalty to truth becomes too expensive for most people. And the world repeats the same old cycle of history once again. When people are weak, they hand power to whoever promises the most. When that person rises, they call submission peace, and when truth is pushed to the margins, they call silence wisdom. But even in that thick darkness, one thing does not change. Lies, no matter how perfectly organized, always have to be maintained through force. Truth, even when it is shoved into the shadows, still exists without needing power to protect it. And that quiet, stubborn existence is a sign that the age of deception, even at its peak, is still only a chapter, not the ending. When the world thinks it has reached the bottom of chaos, when every option has been tried and every promise has been spoken, one raw truth starts to show itself. Human power, no matter how tightly organized, cannot heal what it has already rotted from the inside. Stability built through force begins cracking within. Order built on fear does not produce peace. It only stretches out silence until fear erupts again, even louder. Not because of a lack of discipline, but because of a lack of meaning. People realize they traded too much for a thin sense of safety. The systems of control once praised as the final solution become a burden. Submission no longer brings hope. Worship of power does not close the wounds inside society. And in that moment, when every human voice has run out, what no one can create by effort alone finally arrives. There is no announcement the way people expect, no debates, no persuasion, no negotiation between powers. That presence comes as absolute reality, needing no proof. It does not ask people to believe, it forces people to recognize. Every eye turns to the same point, not because they are compelled, but because they can no longer look away. In that moment, everything people once worshipped reveals how fragile it really is. The symbols of power collapse not after a long war, but in the heavy silence of losing their meaning. Lies repeated millions of times lose their weight. No one needs to argue with them anymore. They dissolve on their own when faced with truth revealed. For those who place their trust in false power, that moment is total collapse. There is no hiding place, no excuse to cling to, no one left to blame. Choices once covered by circumstance are exposed. Fear does not come from punishment, but from the late realization that they gave their loyalty to something that cannot save them. But for those who held steady in the darkness, those who refused to trade conscience for comfort, that moment carries a different meaning. It is not revenge, it is release. Not one group of humans defeating another, but the end of an era where lies were allowed to rule. Their wounds do not vanish instantly, but the burden of having to survive inside a world with inverted values is finally lifted. Restoration begins. Quietly but deeply, not only inside people but in the very structure of the world. The broken pieces of society are no longer held together by force but rearranged on justice. Relationships shattered by fear and suspicion begin to form again, not through promises but through the presence of an order greater than human will. Nature, which had reacted violently to human arrogance, returns to harmony. The earth stops shaking like a warning. The sea stops roaring like an accusation. Not because humans have learned to control them, but because the original order of creation is restored. The world is no longer a battlefield between ambition and fear, but a place where life is cared for and protected. Society is rebuilt not on competition to dominate, but on responsibility to serve. Power does not disappear, but it is no longer the ultimate goal. It becomes a tool to protect justice, to lift up the weak, to maintain order without violence. People stop searching for meaning in standing above others and find it in living in the right place. The memory of the years of chaos is not erased. It is kept as a reminder, not to feed fear, but to feed wakefulness. Humanity looks back and finally understands collapse did not begin from the outside first, but from the inside. That no system can save them if they refuse truth. And that true restoration only comes when humans stop trying to make themselves the center of everything. History, as people once knew it, closes there, not with destruction, but with everything put back in the right place. The world does not end in darkness. It enters a new stage where light does not have to fight to exist. That presence does not only end an era of deception, it opens a reality where truth is no longer negotiated, where justice is no longer postponed, and where life is lived fully, no longer covered by fear. And in that deep silence, humanity finally understands what it forgot through its long journey. The world was never held together by human power, but by a higher order, steadier, unbreakable, and impossible to replace. The deepest lesson is not recognizing evil outside, but recognizing compromise inside yourself. No one gets lost overnight. It starts when you stop questioning, stop reflecting, and stop taking responsibility for what you believe, what you say, and what you do. When morality is treated as pure personal preference, when truth is dismissed as opinion, society may keep functioning, but its soul has already begun to crack. Applying this lesson to life today does not require dramatic actions. It starts with concrete choices, slowing down enough to tell right from wrong instead of running with the crowd, holding on to core values even when they do not pay off immediately, refusing comforting promises that sound good but mean nothing, and building a strong inner life in a world designed to distract you. Staying awake is not fearing tomorrow. It is living with intention today. If you feel content like this helps you see the world more clearly, understand history more deeply, and most of all, understand yourself better, join the Prophetic History Explained community. This is where we explore historical cycles, forgotten warnings, prophetic lessons, and perspectives that help us not only know what happened, but understand why it happened and what it means for the present. And do not forget to subscribe to Prophetic History Explained to support us so we can keep creating deep, meaningful, and different content in the time ahead. Your support is the foundation that allows this community to keep growing, to stay awake, and not repeat the mistakes history has warned about again and again.